Hi, everyone. John Liebman here. You're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I've got a great interview coming up right now with Todd Kerns, also known as Todd Dammit Kerns. And we talk all about his gig with Slash and playing with Miles Kennedy and his bass influences like Billy Sheehan and Paul McCartney and John Paul Jones and on and on. We talk basses, we talk rock and roll, punk rock, playing the bass, and all kinds of other great stuff. Todd Dammit Kerns coming right up. Hi, Todd.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great. Great to see you.
Thank you. You too. Welcome to ForBassPlayersOnly.com. Great to have you.
Great to be here.
Oh, an upright bass behind you. I didn't expect to see that. I hope that doesn't ruin your rock and roll image.
It's funny. I went through a phase of, mild obsession. Slim Jim Phantom's a friend of mine. I'm dropping names already. Watch your feet. He would come to town. He would come to Vegas once in a while to jam. And I'd be like, well, you can't jam that kind of stuff with just a Fender P or something. And so I actually, and I'd already been obsessed with it to begin with. So I kind of, I came across it, picked it up. I got a full scale because most guys play 3/4, but I'm pushing 6/5. So I kind of thought a full scale would be great. It unfortunately goes a little bit neglected now with a Yellow Submarine.
Submarine.
But I went through a period of complete obsession with it. The funniest thing about it is every now and again you would kind of, hey, Jim's coming to town. Great, I'll bust it out. And I hadn't been it's a whole other animal. Like the right hand stuff, it just tears you up. You really have to kind of get back to it for a long time before you sort of take it on stage, because it's pretty physical.
Did you start on upright or electric? Did you even start on bass?
No, the funniest thing about it is I started on acoustic guitar, like most kids. My father had an old harmony, and which was impossible to play, by the way. The
action was pretty high.
Oh, it was just like crazy. They eventually picked me up an Epiphone, an Epi it was called, which I think was an even more affordable Epiphone acoustic, which I don't own anymore. But it and I got around on that a little bit. But the funniest thing about it was, like, it seemed very quickly my father was like, well, you have a guitar, we should probably get you a bass. And I just thought, like, thinking of it now, it just seems like the strangest, like, not just like we should get you an electric guitar. And we bypassed that entirely. And we were in Edmonton, Canada, and we went into, I'm not quite sure which store it was. I want to say Lillo's or something like that. Ended up going home with a Gibson EB3, which I still own. And and from there I was barely really up and running at all before kids were like, in high school. It was sort of like, I guess junior high or whatever. Somebody's like, this guy has a Gibson. That name went a long way. I really was mildly ignorant to all of it, other than the fact that, of course, I'd seen, all the videos or pictures of all your heroes, and Gibson went a long way. So next thing I know, I'm playing with guys like, 5-6 years older than me. And I'm just kind of like riding that root note as hard as possible, because those guys were way more advanced than me, which I think is really important for young musicians.
That's not a bad habit, no matter how advanced you are.
That's true. That's very true.
So you mentioned Edmonton. I wanted to ask you about Canada. Canada is very special to me. Both my wife and my mother are from Canada.
Wow.
But you're from Edmonton, you said.
I'm actually from Saskatchewan. So the trip to Edmonton was more visiting family, and my parents were from a little bit of all over. So every Christmas or summer holiday, it was getting in the camper or whatever and traveling for 8 to 10 hours to go wherever the hell we were going.
I was going to ask if you lived next door to Wayne Gretzky, but now I guess I'll ask if you live next door to the Guess Who.
Yeah. Well, actually, the funniest thing is about back then is we just went to a hockey game last night here in Vegas. We used to go see Wayne Gretzky play all the time, because my father's family was from Edmonton, so we would always end up out there, and we were always going to those hockey games. I'm taking it completely for granted that we were seeing, like, what we were seeing. I'm actually wearing a Rush t-shirt today, too,
I noticed that.
It's very Canadian. Where's your wife from?
Toronto.
My wife's
Toronto, that's how they say it. Toronto.
My wife's from out there as well. So yeah, it's
your wife's from Toronto?
Yep. They're
They probably know each other.
They might. Yeah, it's a big small town.
Well, it's interesting. I wanted to ask you, how do you think growing up in Canada affected your musical influences as compared to what they might have been like had you grown up in the States?
Well, I think you end up with a very sort of diverse sense of, we often have this conversation, me and my friends, about how, we weren't really able to discern who was Canadian, American, English. You know what I mean? It's just music. You hear it there is a Canadian content in Canada. So you are hearing, it is Led Zeppelin, Loverboy, it just get kind of bad. Rolling Stones, it just bounces around, and you're just kind of like, okay, it's just sort of like that meal that is served up every day. You just, you like what you like, and you really gravitate towards what you like. And, but I
imagine you got a pretty good dose of, I don't know, Anne Murray and Gordon Lightfoot and Joni Mitchell.
Of course. Yeah. Like basically everything, like anywhere, it's proud of its exports. And there is music up there that is predominantly known in Canada, like it would be in Sweden or Australia. You know what I mean? Like there are countries that have their music that we just don't know. But like that's a lot like saying like, hey, I'm from Rhode Island, and there was a great band from Rhode Island that I was in love with that no one knew about. You know what I mean? Like that's not uncommon anywhere. So I think there is an interesting thing about Canada. I think maybe the freezing cold had a big effect on once I'd sort of left hockey behind, and once I'd found the guitar, you didn't really spend a lot of time outside because it was so damn cold. So I think a lot of us just kind of like got together and, knocked music around. And I think that might have had some advanced effect on us.
Okay. But you were listening to the radio. You still had, what was the quota? Was like 5% of radio airplay had to be Canadian, or 10%, or some crazy?
I've lost track of that. I mean, my career in the early days benefited greatly from that particular law because, because bands like mine would be like just another, I mean, it's as cutthroat as any other, faction of the music business. But the fact that you are a Canadian band and it was recorded in Canadian and, recorded by Canadian guys in Canada, all those check marks you have to have, it gives you a leg up as far as like if they decide to include you in that said game. So, but yeah, it's it was just a big stew of music you would listen to, like you April Wine, The Who, Kiss. It's like you're getting American, Canadian, international stuff all the time. So it wasn't until later on that you kind of started to discern, okay, well, this is that, and that's this, and this is, obviously you'd see the Beatles interviews and know they don't talk like us. So yeah.
True. Well, it sounds like you grew up with a pretty cool dad, bringing you a guitar and then a bass, and you play both still, right? You play guitar and bass, but there was something that you must have found alluring about the bass. I mean, what is it about the bass? Where was that balance actually growing up? I mean, everybody wants to be a guitar player, and I've interviewed over 800 bass players, and almost all of them had the same story. Well, I played bass because I wanted to play guitar, but they already had enough guitar players, so they said, "You play bass." I said, "Okay, what's a bass?" And then they fell in love with it. So what's your story as far as that goes?
That's generally true. I mean,
actually, that's my story.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's like when you really take a hard look at it, and there's always these ongoing jokes about, oh, the bass player, and and there's always this kind of thing. And I always sort of point out, well, Paul McCartney, Sting, Gene Simmons, not really about their playing level, but they're the most popular people in their bands, and they were the bass player. Geddy Lee. It's like it's one of those things where. I literally, like, I was young. I was very young. The guys were all 5-6 years older than me. Nobody actually, especially back then, it seemed like it was always like you wanted to be a guitar player, you wanted to be a drummer, or you wanted to be a lead singer. You know what I mean? Like that sort of seemed like to be the three like hero positions. And the bass player was always, at least by looking at Bill Wyman or John Paul Jones or John Entwistle, was meant to be quietly. Actually, not quiet at all. John Entwistle was the opposite of quiet, but he was sort of quietly over there while all this insanity was occurring on stage. And that sort of it wasn't until later on that, say, guys like Nikki Sixx or something like that became sort of the focal point of Motley Crue. And you're like, oh, he's the bass player. Or Steve Harris from Iron Maiden was like, it's his band and he's the bass player, you know. These are all weird examples that I bring up all the time because people always like to kind of go, no one cares about the bass player. And it literally was that kind of thing where I just kind of fell into, first of all, I would have been happy just being in a band. I was the, you know, as kids, you always play that game of who has the least worst voice. Like, there's always that guy who's quite bold who wants to sing, and he sings, and he's often not the best singer. And then they kind of go around there. Okay, now will you sing one? Now you sing one. And it kept coming back to me that I had a little bit of a, you know, a pitch and tone thing that people seem to like. And it would just mention, hey, make Todd sing this. And the next thing you know, I was kind of like the lead singer in a bunch of these different things that I was doing too. So in that case, guys like Sting were very important to me because I would look at Sting, and Sting was actually pretty important to me as a kid because he was really able to kind of split his brain in half and play bass parts that don't really accommodate what he's singing. And it was really challenging to kind of go, there are several of his songs that I still, Driven to Tears from Zenyatta Mandata is one of those songs where I'm still like, I don't know how he's playing and singing that. He's a jazz guy. So there's something else going on there, but it really opened up a lot in me. Even when I do play guitar sometimes, I'm often pretty good at playing something that doesn't really connect with the vocal on top of the bass or on top of the guitar part or whatever. And that's been a big learning curve for me.
You just mentioned a lot of bass players. I wanted to ask you who your influences were. And I don't know if it was Joe. You got your Tim Hortons mug there. I see you.
I know, right? There's nobody more Canadian than a Canadian not living in Canada.
Funny. Well, who were your bass influences once you first discovered the instrument? Was it most of those guys that you mentioned?
Pretty much. I think as a kid, you know, obviously guys like Paul McCartney are a big deal. Even though, you know, it's some people will, I mean, there's a lot of the learning curve of that kind of music too. The walking, again, he's another guy that will, you know, when he's going, close your eyes and I'll kiss you. And he's walking the whole time. And you're just like, and there's a big smile on his face and he's 22 and you're like, oh my God, this guy's, you know, this guy's an animal. I mean, you don't really give him, yeah, it's one of those things where I was so much more interested in the all-around thing about being a musician, not just being the kind of, I'm going to sit in my basement and shred. I was immediately in bands. Like, it was never sort of like me in my basement, just sort of like by myself. And briefly it was like that, but it was very quickly I was playing with other guys. So all those guys, you know, and it's funny when I bring up guys like, you know, like The Who was a huge deal to me, John Entwistle. It sort of creates that other side of bass playing where that sort of pseudo lead bass playing starts to come into effect, where the constant experiment with, you know, well, my bass tone doesn't sound like that. And then you start to go down that thing of Chris Squire and Geddy Lee and even Tom Peterson from Cheap Trick, and realizing these guys are playing through a combination of a bass amp with a guitar amp, which is completely insane to a kid who can barely afford one amp, let alone, you know, we'd go through all kinds of different phases of destroying and blowing up different things to try and find tones that we'd like, or finding different basses that we enjoyed and that were comfortable. But I think that, you know, it wasn't so much one person particularly most of the time. I went through a huge punk rock thing as a kid, and that was always less is more, you know, and that was always, but it taught you a lot about just stay out of the way. You know, it's sort of like, you know, you're a support position. In fact, most of the band is a support position because it's all just four guys just barreling through on this 3-chord kind of thing and working on being tight as a unit rather than the individual sort of having his moment to shine. That's not what punk rock was all about. And, you know, and then heavy metal, of course, sort of seeped in. I was lucky enough to grow up in a small town where there wasn't really a group of kids who said, you have to listen to goth, or you have to listen to, you know, heavy metal, or you have to listen to punk rock. It was just sort of like, we liked what we liked, and that seemed to be enough. It wasn't until later on when I got a little older that I realized that there was actually like fierce lines drawn between a lot of these different scenes that you were ne'er to cross, you know, but I was crossing all over the place. And it's
well, I want to pick up on that for a minute, because in a different circle, you touched on lead bass. You mentioned Chris Squire and Entwistle and a couple of others. What about guys like Stanley Clarke? I mean, you're a rock guy, and that's a different thing. But was he on your radar at all? Because he was doing some pretty innovative things back in the 70s that other people weren't doing.
Of course he was. You know, it's funny that you bring him up because I became familiar with Stanley through Ronnie Wood had a side band from the Stones. Was it the New Barbarians? I can't remember. But Stanley was the bass player, and I was like, "Who is this guy?" And he had a huge coffee table alembic bass, and it sounded nuts. And no, I thought he was. I mean, obviously, I would go into that world, and it was basically like trying to learn Mandarin Chinese or something. It's kind of like it was like, what is going on here? You know, it's like I was having a hard enough time really wrapping my head around things like Chris Squire and Geddy Lee. To me, you know, it's like I was always more of a Cheap Trick and straight up rock and roll kind of guy, but a great appreciation for those guys nonetheless, especially when it comes to the tones that they were creating on an instrument that was largely meant to be, you know, when you look at the Bill Wymans of the world, to kind of quietly just be over there and support, even though Bill, I think his playing is very underrated. But that position was always meant to be kind of like, no. You just stand over there and quietly just kind of support all this awesome stuff that's going on. You know, like Michael Anthony from Van Halen constantly gets just passed over. You know, recently we had a jam night in the year passing of Eddie Van Halen. And a bunch of my friends and I got up at this club here in town. We just jammed Van Halen songs. And my friend's playing bass. I was just singing, you know, just because I was there. And I look over at my friend during the guitar solo for whatever song, and he's playing these Michael Anthony bass lines. I go, is that what Michael's playing? Like, it's like, good Lord, you know. It's the position of the bass player that is meant to be kind of pushed into the corner, unless you're Stanley Clarke or Billy Sheehan or even Billy. You know, I know Billy, and, you know, it's like talking to a 6th degree black belt when you're still a yellow belt. You're just looking at him like, I don't know, like he's just on a whole other level, but he's still a master of playing the song. You know, I mean, he finds a way to do what he does, but he's big on just sort of, you know, this is a song. He's aware of the pop orchestration of a straight up rock and roll song, Mr. Big and all that. Although it lent itself to having moments of flexing his muscles, he just played the song, you know.
I sat down with him one-on-one in Germany. It was at one of the Warwick base camps.
Sure, yeah.
And I went like 3 or 4 times. And he came up to me like Friday night. He says, you want to get together tomorrow? Just sit down and I'll show you some stuff. I said, yeah.
Wow.
So he was showing me some things, and I got to admit, I shouldn't admit this publicly, but I said, Billy, that's all really important. And this is really great to know, but show me something that looks good, you know? Sure. And
the pyrotechnics, no one does it better than him. Yeah.
You mentioned Michael Anthony. Actually, I've interviewed almost every single person that you just mentioned.
Wow.
I'm still working on Stanley. I mean, he keeps saying, yeah, we'll do it. But yeah, even Paul McCartney, Billy Sheehan, Michael Anthony is what I wanted to mention. I went backstage when he was he came through town with Sammy Hagar, and we went in his dressing room, and I just took my phone, I interviewed him, and I looked yesterday, I think it was 1.2 million views so far on YouTube. But the reason I mentioned that is not for that, but because the number of people that came out, the comments in favor of him versus the paltry number that were against him. I mean, he's such a class guy, and a lot of people are just bashing the other guys in the band. But
his voice.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, people are saying the vocals that he contributed, which honestly contributed. I wasn't even aware of how prominently he contributed.
Yeah, if you go back and listen now, it's hard to imagine that band without Michael's voice. Actually,
yeah. It seems like you know the questions I was prepared to ask you. Traditionally, the personality of the traditional image of the bass player is the guy that stands in the background. And you're a bass player, but that is just not your personality, is it?
Not so much. You know, it's funny that you bring that up because, you know, as I was, you know, a kid, it's funny because punk rock really sort of didn't really adhere to any of that because it's punk rock. So it's like, you know, it didn't matter if you were, you know, the guitar player, the bass player, the drummer, or the singer. It was kind of like just everybody just go crazy. It was like, the idea was like, you know, just there's no like rules as to how you're supposed to be. But I think that tradition of John Paul Jones or Bill Wyman and Entwistle, those 3 guys, for whatever reason, always seemed like as important and integral to the thing they were very sort of laid back. But then as things went on, Gene Simmons or Nikki Sixx or Steve Harris. And I'm using these examples as guys who were like, it was sort of showmanship. And even Paul McCartney, really, I mean, even though he was very, very focal in that band, no matter, I mean, obviously it's the Beatles. It's almost an exception to a much larger rule in every essence of the word. But, and then you get the, and I'm talking just more from a stage persona rather than the Billy Sheehan style. But even Billy, like, when you'd watch Billy play, he wasn't, hiding in the background. He was in many ways a very big part of the show. And with Slash, like playing with Slash, the funniest thing about Slash, and I thought of this the other day because somebody asked something about like, is he concerned what kind of bass you're playing? Does he worry about, the jacket you're wearing? Does he worry about where you are on stage or what you're doing? I think obviously he's aware of it. And I think if there was anything that was weird, he might bring it up, but he's never once said to me, you need to play this kind of bass. You need to dress like this, or you need to kind of stand back there and shut up. It's like, just kind of like, just do what you do at 110% and that'll be great. And I've always sort of been like, attracted to, and a lot of the bass players that I bring up, like guys like Lemmy or whatever, it's like, these are guys who are also frontmen or singers in the band as well. So it sort of creates another element there that it does not quite the same as just being the bass player per se. But Nikki Sixx is another example of a guy who, to me, I was kind of like, being a kid and looking at Motley Crue and going, well, that's the coolest guy. And he's the bass player, and sure, he's not Billy Sheehan, but, he's still, his visual persona was so much more to me than almost any other guy in the band. And it sort of lent the idea that, hey, you don't have to be Bill Wyman. Not that there's anything wrong with being Bill Wyman, clearly, but you can definitely be a focal point or feel like just, given 110% regardless, whatever your instrument is.
Mm-hmm. And Paul McCartney, I think there's something just magical about him. He's a great bass player because they needed a bass player because the other guy died, and we've heard him play piano, we've heard him play guitar, we've heard him sing. He has an uncanny ability to know exactly what a song needs. And that's just,
The interesting thing about Paul that I've always thought too is when that conversation came up for a guy who essentially was a guitar player, when it came up like, well, someone's going to have to play bass. First of all, John he was, as skilled as he was probably at his chording and all that kind of stuff, he probably didn't have that kind of ability to kind of think in bass terms. You know what I mean? George was definitely a guitar player. He wasn't going to put that thing down. Paul must have, had that kind of thing of like, okay, well, here we go. Maybe the adventurous nature of who he is, because we always kind of forget that he wasn't a bass player until he was well into the Beatles were already sort of doing their thing. And then they sort of, okay, well, now I'm going to be the bass player. So he's learning, in the middle of it all. When I say learning, I mean, he just must have had like a natural sort of sense of how to do this. And yeah, like you say, his musicality of it all is pretty mind blowing. And even seeing them live now, Brian will pick up the bass when Paul picks up his 59 left-handed Les Paul, and he's singing, he's playing the organ, he's playing the piano, it's pretty staggering. And he's a pretty damn good drummer.
He wrote a few good songs too.
Yeah, he's written a couple. That kid's got a future.
George, every time I heard Taxman the other day on the radio, and I just can't understand why he counts it off at one tempo and then starts playing it at another.
So strange. Yeah. So strange. That's my favorite Beatles album, as much as that probably varies from time to time. For whatever reason, Revolver.
Okay.
Yeah, Revolver had such an effect on me as a kid. Although they all did, really. It's such an interesting thing. I just saw the Stones the other night, and it was pretty magical, actually. But because I was never really of the generation that was like, it was either the Beatles or the Stones. It's kind of more like it was just one big hodgepodge of stack of albums that your uncle kind of went like, my record player doesn't work anymore. Here, take these or whatever. And I'd be like, what is this? And I would go home he basically gave me, he may as well have handed me like $1,000. It would have had the same effect on the effect of just going home with all these like, just like the Who and the Stones and even things like the Guess Who and all that stuff was just a wealth of. I'm so jealous of kids today who discover Led Zeppelin like right now or the Rolling Stones right now and realize that there's like 50 years worth of music to go back and dig into, you know.
Yeah.
It's what it was like for us.
Well, what's great is that my kid, well, I have 4 kids. 3 of them know pretty much all the classic rock and the standards. And well, one daughter was into the newer stuff. And actually my other daughter's into country music. And but they know my son is a senior right now at Berkeley in Boston.
Oh, wow.
Guitar player, and he was out in LA for a while. Because all the classes were online because of COVID. And he says,
of course,
I lived through a Boston winter. I'm going. He took his girlfriend. They went to LA for a year.
By all means, yeah.
Got an internship, and he was assisting on sessions with Abe Laboriel Jr. and Michael Landau and films and Netflix.
Wow.
And yeah, he's just killing it. I'm so proud of him. And I learned a lot from him. You know, and you know, we learned theory, we learned this and that, but he keeps me on my toes with you know, amazing. Theory is still the same as it was when I was in school. They have their own way of looking at things there at Berkeley, and he's a senior now. I can't believe it.
That's amazing. Wow.
What is keeping you busy these days?
Oh, I'm busier than ever for whatever reason. It's so funny because a lot of recording projects have come up. Especially during COVID, you know, which we're still going through. I love calling it during COVID when we're still kind of living through it. But you know, during the lockdown, it became like my friends are all, you know, they have projects and we should do this and we should do that. And I'm sort of like, yeah, let's do that. That sounds great. Because as far as I knew, 2021 was going to be a complete wash. And then all of a sudden, mid 2021, I'm like, you know, the phone starts ringing and can you do this? And can you be here? And can you do that? I'm like, okay, and now I'm sort of living the life of about 5 or 6 people, but it's a good problem to have. You know, it's always that way of like reminding myself that when I was, say, 15, if I had told myself then that this is what you're going to be doing when you're a grown-up, I would have been like, wow, that sounds amazing. Where sometimes now you get completely overwhelmed, like, okay, so today I wake up, I got to talk to John, I'm going to run over and see Bruce Kulick and the guys from the Kiss Cruise band that we've been doing. Then I got to go over to the studio, do a vocal for that thing I got to do. Then I got to come back, take my wife to the James Bond movie. Because you got to kind of balance the whole goddamn thing. And then tomorrow wake up and it's just equally as like, okay, then I got to make sure I go over to the studio. You know, it's like, but it's a good problem to have. So the Slash album comes out, the new Slash album comes out in February, and we recorded it in April of this, just past April, in Nashville, which was exciting, although it was under complete strict COVID restrictions. And we all got COVID anyway, which is the funny part of the whole thing. Yeah, it was just completely insane. But we bubbled ourselves in a tour bus out to Nashville, and we just basically lived in the studio and a big old Airbnb that we were like a ranch kind of style place we were living in. And we just kind of went back and forth and still managed to get sick. But so
where did it start out? You went to Nashville on a bus, and how long was that bus ride?
Well, it was a couple days, so we're not sure if someone.
Where did you start out? Were you in California or Vegas?
Los Angeles. Slash came from Los Angeles, picked us up in Vegas, and we just moved east. Yeah, so I'm not sure if someone touched the wrong door handle at a Flying J or or what along the way. But Miles got sick, and then shortly thereafter, myself and the drummer got sick.
Good boy.
And I felt okay. I was vaccinated, oddly enough, at the time, and kind of bounced back pretty fast. The other guys were kind of a little slower, and then Slash eventually went down. It was very fascinating, but the record's really live and really like. It was funny talking about it because Dave Cobb, the producer, was very sort of like, let's make it like the first Black Sabbath album, you know. And I'm like, okay, and I would define what that means. You know, it's like in living in the modern age where we've been making, I do it every day, making records where in this day and age where the drummer's in Sweden and the guitar player's in Italy, and you know, it's like all this stuff is coming to me, and I'm like doing stuff, sending off files, you know, click tracks, you know, all that kind of stuff. Like lots of not actual amps, they're like in the box kind of amps and stuff like that. But then with these guys, it was sort of like we're in the room together. It's basically like Black Sabbath 1969, where the amps are in the room with the drums. Everything's bleeding everywhere. We got the singer in a vocal booth to save him from this insanity. But it was it creates this whole no click tracks, no auto tune, just looking at each other going like, is this the verse section? Okay. And then just, and that whole thing. And there was a weird part of me that initially was like, can we actually do this? And I'm like, well, of course we can do this. This is the way they made records. You go to Sun Studios or Abbey Road. This is how they made records. They literally, I mean, their amps were probably in separate rooms, but they were just like, let's just make a rock record. And I was like, this sounds exciting in a lot of ways, especially it was so anti 21st century. It was on 2-inch tape and very bold. And I was like, well, I'm very curious to see how the single's doing great, but I'm very curious to see how it, when you're imagining listening to modern rock radio, when there's all these groups that are, recorded under modern sort of circumstances. And then all of a sudden this monster comes out that's, it's like an early Aerosmith sounding, and then it moves on. It's sort of, we'll see. It was a lot of fun though, and very, very exciting.
Well, to be consistent with that spirit, is it going to be released on vinyl?
Of course. Yeah. We've actually, yeah. It would be silly not to. Luckily, Slash is of the mind that we've released everything we've ever done on vinyl in one fashion or another. But even before, it was sort of like, because how popular vinyl has become over the years, and which is fascinating to me for a guy who's had the same record since I was a kid, It's really exciting. It's funny because you get the CD and you go, oh, cool. And then it isn't until you see the vinyl, like, oh, wow. It's like, that's when you sort of get this like, oh, cool. Gatefold, you open it up. Oh, wow. It just reminds you of being like, you're getting Frampton Comes Alive or Cheap Trick Live at Budokan. And you just put the record on. The experience of listening to vinyl to me, even still, isn't like you put it on while you're doing stuff around the house. It's the actual act of putting the record on and then sitting there and reading Bob Ludwig mastered this, all these names that you would hear as a kid. I had no idea who Bob Ludwig is. I know who he is now, and all these different names and different things that you would just get accustomed to. It's still that way.
Sitting in the bedroom and looking at it when it opened up, whether it was double or not, that was really cool. But
very exciting. Yeah.
I was always, not when I was like 13, 14, but a little older. I had to know who all the players were. I had to know who the producer was, the engineer, the
songwriters. Yeah. A&R guy. Who's David Geffen? You're like, oh, okay.
On the front, actually, of the cover.
Yeah.
What kind of bass or basses are you playing? And if you have like 100 basses, I bet you have 1 or 2 or 3 that are your go-to basses. What are you playing these days?
Well, it's been really interesting for me because it's been such a, I think like anybody, you have your sort of like, because my most recent thing, although I'm very affiliated with Gibson, and I'm a tall guy, I'm a huge man, so the Gibson Thunderbird has always been sort of what I might kind of go to. There's something about the humbuckers and those things and the way they react with a guitar amp, and that's sort of always been not a secret at all, but the ability to kind of run my stuff through a bass amp and through a guitar amp to find that sort of magical, this is all the low end and all the presence and all the depth, and this is this sort of unruly thing. And it's when you mix them together that you make magic happen, And
isn't there a amp that'll do that? Isn't there enough of a demand for it that somebody would come up with something?
I think that they've messed around with a lot of stuff. I think what's been a huge thing for me has been like things like the Sans amp. The Sans amp, Tech 21 Sans amp has just been kind of like, oh wow, because I've been running that mostly as my main tone for like, especially when I'm doing fly stuff and whatnot. I'm like, just run this Sans amp. It has a perfect blend of all that. So in a funny way, it's funny that you bring that up because that's actually been sort of like actually, oddly enough, I have this right here. One of the Samurai Warriors is the Geddy Lee Sans amp. So this is actually really cool. And my production partner and I, we've been sort of Pepsi taste challenging a lot of those kind of things because it's always big on the what's this pedal do? What's this pedal do? But in my world, it's always a little more unruly. And I think Slash sort of like in the early days with Slash, I tried to play it like, you try to play it professionally and do it like this. And Slash would be kind of like, we would listen to some recording of something else and he'd go like, you should do your bass sound like that. And I go, oh, am I allowed to do that? Because that's kind of where I kind of go. And a lot of the time with the sort of more distorted bass tone, it isn't as noticeable until it's by itself. When it's within the entire the ensemble is playing, the drums and the guitars and the vocals are all happening. It's more about finding that place where it kind of pokes out rather than gets lost in the shuffle. Or, you know, because it's one of those interesting things about bass, especially in a large venue. It's almost like people notice when it's not there than when it is. Like if the bass just suddenly stops due to some sort of technical problem, you know, people can't really articulate what's happened, but it just something weird has happened. Everything just dropped out. And sometimes that's a big effect. You stop playing at that certain part of the song because it's kind of, and when you come back in, it's like everything lifts back up. But that's been an ongoing, I mean, it's always that way for players, isn't it? We're always kind of like, so the newest thing that I've been doing over the last few years is I had a company out of Vancouver called Prestige Guitars. We started doing, because for me, it's always like, I like the size of this, I like the feel of this neck, but I'm not crazy about these pickups, or I love this, I like that. I don't like these the way the knobs and the selectors and everything are configured. You know what I mean? So for me, I had them design a signature bass for me, which is, oddly enough, we released it between Slash tours. So we decided to go with the 6-string electric guitar version, which ended up doing really well. It won a platinum award through NAMM 2017. And that was really exciting. So it's been very interesting to me to kind of like, because I'm the kind of guy, you know, when all my friends were trying to look at girls in magazines, I was like, oh my God, look at this, you know, looking at like, you know, a Gibson recording Les Paul or whatever it was when I was a kid, like looking at stuff and just drooling at magazines of old guitars. To suddenly find your instrument in Guitar Player magazine was
That's a true music lover, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at this. This is embarrassing. I have a wife that puts up with this, but it's you know, and I think that, you know, for me, it was mostly building a bass that was built for the Slash experience, because the Slash experience, what we do in our show, isn't really about like, there's not like multiple layers of like, and then we'll bring it down and I break out the fretless and then I do this and I break out the hollow body. It's like, no, it's pretty much just, you know, it's just like Unleash the Hounds at song 1 and we just raise hell for 2 hours and then good night, you know. So what I wanted to do mostly was kind of have the high output, really high output. Actually, they wound them even hotter for me. Seymour Duncan wound them even hotter for me on the on these humbucker type Thunderbird type pickups. And then like it's been really noodled down to where I'm like, I'm the same way with most things. It's like, rather than like adjusting my tones here and there, I want to adjust. The bass is very simple. It has like a 1 volume knob. I don't mess with the tone knob. So it's down to 1 volume knob and an on-off switch for myself, because nothing drives me crazier than between songs having that kind of like, you know, feedback or any sort of string noise. So I'm constantly shutting myself off. It's just something I've always sort of been really big on. So usually guys just turn themselves down, you know, but the act of turning down my knob isn't as easy as just flicking the switch. So I have reverse headstock because I'm really big on that. That's a whole other conversation. Guys like Richard Fortus from Guns N' Roses, he'll go on to me about, well, the reverse headstock is great because the tension on the E string versus the G string or the E string, high E string, depending on the guitar or bass. And I'm like, I just thought it looks cool. But he's like, he's got a whole thing to it. I go, well, I guess I've stumbled onto that because I just like the way it always kind of felt. And so it's very, then it's basically a case of like getting your tone set up through the Sans amp, through your amp, and deciding that's the tone, you know. So this is the sound of this guitar. This is the way this guitar sounds. So now you have to adjust all that here. And like I said, sure, there are things that I dial off on, you know, on a certain part because we're doing kind of a slower type song. And I'm more of a pick guy, although I do play with fingers. But with the attack of what this thing is, it's just a specific kind of animal. It's a very strange mixture of punk rock and hard rock, really, is what Slash's whole. It's very aggressive and very sort of. It's not about subtlety at all, really. It can be like at certain points, but it's only there to kind of like trick you into thinking, like lulling you into a sense of security before we come back out and bash you over the head again. So,
how many pieces do you take on the road with you then?
I generally take about 4. You can get carried away, but I sort of always have. I think I can get as much as 5 or 6 sometimes, but generally I have a main that will sort of kind of carry the set, or 2 mains that carry the set. I have a drop D one, although usually have a what do you call it? The
hip shot.
Hip shot on a lot of them. I just like to make sure that one is kind of like, for that specific thing, is going to be perfectly in tune. I mean, we're lucky enough to have techs, you know what I mean? So it's a whole other animal. In a fly date situation, like with my friends, I was just playing with Steven Adler or Corey Taylor from Slipknot. I just take a P bass and run out on the road, because the one thing about a good old P bass is that bolt-on neck is going to survive a plane ride in the overhead compartment better than, well, and then those Thunderbirds are, it's like carrying a coffin around. It's like it's not really worth it. But
primarily a 4-string guy. Sounds
primarily, yeah. I have tampered with both fretless and 5-string basses in different configurations as well. I also own a couple of Tom Peterson 12 strings, but yeah. I always find us kind of going back to like, that kind of thing of like, if it doesn't really add to the song per se, it sort of gets kind of lost in the mix. And
that's important. Not everybody realizes that. I played that 12 string. I was interviewing Tom backstage.
It's a monster. Which one did you play?
I think they're all Gretches, and they're all yellow or green or whatever. But
the new ones are Gretches. His most recent ones are Gretches. But I've loved Tom since I was a kid, because he's a bass player that sounds like he's like 3 guitar players as well.
Yeah. What kind of strings do you play?
I've been using Ernie Ball, especially with the Slash Camp, for years. I've obviously played a bunch. I really like Roto Sound and
Twistle wires.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing about those that I learned as a kid, because you would, they felt like the holy grail when you would find them, is that they didn't always last as long. They're amazing on day 1, less amazing day 2, day 3, day 4. It starts to get kind of like, and I just didn't, as a young player, it wasn't like you were like going to spend all your money buying Rotosound strings. So, although in reality, I am a big fan, and I found the Ernie Ball. We've been playing a bunch of different kinds, some cobalt mixed ones, and they've been really consistent, really great. Again, I'm lucky to have a tech, so the strings are changed I don't like them changed every day. There's something about the really over the top brightness sometimes. I don't know about you, but once in a while there's that P bass that's been sitting around just getting gnarlier and gnarlier. When you pick it up and you go, oh, there it is. Like, now we're in the zone. Yeah. And then you're terrified to change the strings, because there's a whole process of like having to find that happy. Yeah, you want the James again. Duck Dunn sound. Exactly. And that's the thing too, is on a few of these, like I've got a Jack Cassidy there. I don't have a lot of my stuff up here, and a Hofner over here somewhere. And I always have flat wounds on those. Oh, and a Longhorn there, oddly enough, covered in passes at the moment, but a Dan Electro. And I always try to have like some flat wounds on those guys, because that's a lot of fun. And specifically for particular songs and stuff like that, or different recordings here and there. It's like, this feels like it should be that, you know what I mean? And then I wanted to take this opportunity to ask you about bass technique and learning bass. I mentioned we have well over 800 interviews now on the site, but we're really becoming well known at ForBassPlayersOnly.com as pretty much the premier place to learn bass online. We've got students from pretty much every state in the U.S. and 50-some countries worldwide. They're coming specifically to learn bass, and it's not the people I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be the kids, maybe college kids. Most of the people that I attract are men in their 50s, 60s, 70s. Wow. And they're not career bound. They're not trying to set the world on fire. They are, maybe they're retired. Maybe they have some time now. They just want to play. They've dabbled with it, perhaps. They just want to get together with their buddies, play some blues, play some classic rock riffs, maybe some walking bass lines, and just have fun playing bass. So in that context, what do you think is important for somebody who wants to learn bass? What do you think they need to know? It's funny that you're in that up, because it's a constant conversation. My kids both are musical, but didn't really pursue it beyond kind of like, dabbling, and just are very naturally talented. But I think that they call me in 30 or 40 years and I'll take care. Exactly. It's funny, because I think that they look at like what dad's life is and go, yeah. Oh, that's what that means. Or even the idea of just, getting up in front of people and playing music is a whole other animal. But That's kind of the thing for me, is I think that for what happened to me was all that what you're talking about now, learning and technique and kind of finding yourself along the way. I was already on stage playing well before I even had a chance to even consider any of that, because it was sort of like joining this band and we're playing the local high school dance. And I'm like, okay, I can barely play, like I said, I just rock those root notes all the way. But, as you go along, I think it's important for kids to, if I was going to start from scratch, I'd be listening to things like AC/DC, or because I always think that, that is a band that is such an underrated thing. And I have so many friends over the years who would be like, I don't want to play that. That's, boring or whatnot. And I think to myself, that is a perfect example of five perfect pieces of a puzzle that come together and make something very magical. And if Cliff Williams, the bass player for AC/DC, had done anything differently, it wouldn't have been as effective. It wouldn't have been as sort of impactful. You know what I mean? And there's a lot that he's doing that people don't they kind of think of it as so simple, but every once in a while he's doing a third. You know what I mean? He's not doing the D chord. He's playing an F sharp, and you're like, that's very clever. And you're thinking, now, is that Mutt Lange's decision, or was that, so that kind of stuff. But there is a sort of ability to kind of, learn a song like Highway to Hell and be able to jam it with your friends the next day and go like, I'm playing a song. I'm playing, with some guys and we're doing something. And as soon as you kind of break the seal on that, and you've kind of learned Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones or whatever, I'm talking with guys who are coming like from nothing into it. Because a lot of guys will go, I want to learn a Led Zeppelin song, and I'm always like, dude, that's, you got to at least get your yellow belt together before we start moving into that. Not to say you couldn't play Rock and Roll by Led Zeppelin and just ride. That's actually the song that I always think about. Like when I was a kid, it would be like, we're going to play Rock and Roll by Zeppelin. Okay. And I would just ride that on it while the guitar's making all the moves. I'm just ride the A string. Then I go to that D string, just that 1-5-4 that you can get around a 1-5-4 if you just ride the root for a long time. And then, but as time goes on, I was always very, like I said, I was always very into Paul McCartney, and underrated as I think he is. Gene Simmons in Kiss had lots of walking lines that I was always like, whenever I hear those songs, I go, no one talks about this bass line. It's like he's walking around, he's singing and walking around because he was a big Paul McCartney guy. So all that kind of walking around type stuff I picked up along the way. I was never really, really kind of like blues never really had a big effect on me because it was a bunch of white kids in small town Canada listening to loud rock and roll. And the blues was sort of like an older dudes kind of thing that they were into. We always loved it. And when you would sit down and go ZZ Top or any of the kind of more generic, that's not the right word, but things that would be sort of blues oriented, you would learn so much just kind of going any of the 1-5-4 type stuff. Any type of 1-5-4, once you learn, okay, well, this is in G, so C, D, and in A, D, E, you start to kind of like learn that kind of stuff, and really kind of be able to hang. And I think that was the big thing to me, is that I was just so desperate to go and play with people that it wasn't so much about me in the basement by myself. It was like, no, I want to be, making a bunch of racket with my friends. But all that other stuff, as far as whether you want to play with your fingers, whether you want to play with your pick, with a pick, and then constantly people are telling me, what kind of bass should I get for my kid? They want to play. And I'm like, I don't know. You don't drop $3,000 on a, awesome instrument if the kid's going to end up just having it in his closet later on. There's always those great little Fender Squiers and Epiphone this and Ibanez sound gear. Those basses are very popular for young people who don't feel like dropping a lot of cash right away. But I know guys who drop a lot of cash on guitars who don't play guitar. It's like, they got like, they got like way nicer stuff than this, but they're like they just a dentist or a lawyer who's got a bunch of extra money who just loves the instruments and has great stuff. They don't really have any interest in playing beyond like noodling around the house, and that's enough.
Probably have a $50,000 in the living room too that nobody's ever touched.
Bananas, yeah, it's bananas. I've the nicest stuff I've ever seen is often with people who aren't really musicians, except Slash. Slash has ridiculous stuff.
What would you be if you weren't a bass player?
That's interesting. The only other thing I ever considered was being like a school teacher of some sort. It was the weirdest thing that I was young enough to have been bitten by this bug that conversation never really happened with myself. It was sort of like that road was sort of laid out in front of me, that like my older friends were desperately waiting for me to get out of high school so we could go on the road. My parents were very much like, well, no, you need to finish high school at least. And I was just kind of like just vibrating to get the hell out of there. I lived in a small town of 1,500 people, no street lights, no McDonald's. So I was kind of like, getting out to the city was just very eye-opening to me when on the occasion that I did it, and I was like, I got to get out of here. I got to get out there and do the thing. So I honestly don't know. I think it was the only other thing that I remember thinking like, and there's such a performance aspect to being a teacher, I think, kind of making stuff interesting. The best teachers I remember, were the ones that made things like Shakespeare interesting, where most kids would be like, like kill me now. I thought, if you can sell, it's salesmanship, it's showmanship all the way. Like the ability to like, what I'm teaching you is really boring, but you got to put some pizzazz on it, And I always thought that, well, I've got a bit of that. I can make that happen, but that never really happened. And I'm, it isn't until like, later on after doing this for as long as I've been doing this, like, most of my life I've been performing or recording or doing whatever. It's times like now where I sort of realize how fortunate I am that, to be able to do this as a living, is something that's not lost on me because, my dad worked at a job that wasn't that into for, he worked hard at it until he could finally retire. And then he started living his life. And I kind of thought, maybe I might've been bitten by that idea of like, well, I'd rather just do what I wanted to. And then, and then the idea of retirement becomes like, and do what? I'd probably just play music anyway. It's like, oh, I always kind of giggle when we're at like some restaurant and there's some guy in the corner playing piano and singing songs, and I look at my wife and I go, there's the future. Like, when I'm 75 years old and I don't feel like traveling anymore or whatever, I'll just be playing over there, entertaining people there.
Yeah. You mentioned Anne Murray. I mentioned her earlier in our conversation. I believe she was a school teacher before she became a pop star.
She may have been. She's like, she's like a god up in Canada. Yeah.
The song "You Needed Me," and I don't remember what else she had, but I'm sure.
Snowbird. There was a song called Snowbird. Yeah,
it's a nice song. I like it.
It's a great song. Yeah. She was wonderful. Yeah.
When did they start calling you by your nickname?
That's from the old punk rock days. Everybody had like Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious, and then Todd Dammit rhymes with the expletive GD. So it just sort of kind of caught on. And it was something that was like when I was younger, and we kind of lost it for a while. I came down to Vegas completely starting from scratch after having a recording career in Canada, and sort of, the interesting thing about my life is having the 9 lives of a musician, where you kind of run you run out of gas in one circumstance in Canada. Did the thing, got signed, made records. We were actually signed out of New York City. Our label was out of New York. Our management was out of New York. And I had this very dream situation to be like a kid from Canada who basically has an international situation kind of unfolding. You put the record out, the band break, we do our thing, we struggle, we fight, scratch our way to any sort of success for 10 years. Break up, you do your thing for a few more years, and I just thought it was sort of random really in ending up in the US that I just sort of came down here and sort of wasn't really an intention to completely relocate at all. I just sort of, it was like 15 years ago in October, this past October.
Why Vegas though?
Because I had friends down here. And I was a struggling, artist, using the bunny ears quotes. In my mind, we were, struggling for our art and writing music, and we were going to get signed. And then the record industry started to change with downloading and everything else. And it just sort of became like, it started to kind of sway in the direction we are now, where performing and playing live and all that is sort of where the bread and butter is. The recording of music and writing music has become, although it's obviously a major part of it, it's sort of like an excuse to go out and play music, and all that sort of thing. So in a lot of ways, I just sort of came down here to suss it out. My intention was to eventually end up in Los Angeles, but I had friends here working and recording and doing whatnot. So I just kind of came down on a just to check it out. And then that turned into this opportunity and that opportunity, and then Slash, and that sort of kept me here for the past 15 years. And through that, my point with the nickname was that when I came down here, I started playing with these guys from Faster Pussycat and a bunch of these bands. We started doing these jam nights, around town, and I would always introduce myself as Todd Dammit, because I just thought it was hilarious that no one knew who Todd Kerns was. You know, it's like none of these people know who. I don't have the reputation of being that guy from that thing. I only have that reputation when I go back home. So I just thought it was kind of funny to do that. And Vinnie Paul from Pantera, the drummer, he loved it. He would shout my name across casinos, Todd Dammit. And I'd be like, hello. I don't think he knew who Todd Kerns was. He just only know who Todd Dammit. So it just became a thing, and it kind of caught on. And now it's sort of like, you know, now you either get rid of it or you kind of carry it with you. So I carry it with me.
Did you make it up?
No, it was like, Toddzilla, this kind of just silly things that they would call you. Somebody along the way in our punk rock world just sort of came up with Todd Dammit, and that just sort of stayed. Again, I was never using a publicly used name. It was just sort of like a little nickname that sort of that just was around, and then I just started using it as a gag more than anything else. Sort of keeps you out of trouble too. It wasn't me. That was Todd Dammit. I
Well, Todd, damn it, Todd. I mean, Todd, I'm sure you get that a lot too. I have kept you a lot longer than I had promised, and it's all because you're a fascinating man.
Oh, not at all. I'm happy to talk about this kind of stuff. It's actually funny to get to actually talk about the ins and outs of the instrument and stuff like that. I think it's something we don't get the opportunity to do unless guys like you come along and sort of prod it loose.
Yeah, well, I enjoy it. That's what I do. And there's so much more we could talk about, but why don't we just leave it open for a follow-up interview?
Exactly. For part 2.
Part 2. Yeah, I've done it before. Well, thank you so much, Todd. I really, really appreciate it. And I know that our audience is going to enjoy very much watching this interview and learning a lot and being inspired to go out and do something crazy.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend. You take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.